Good day everyone. Today I'm going to discuss about directional equivalence. And in this topic, I'll be discussing about two kinds of similarity, directionality and definitions of relevance, back translation as a test, and polarities of directional equivalence. Directionality is a key feature of translational equivalence, and translations are thus the result of active translators' decisions. Whereas the subparadigm of natural equivalence develops categories of translation procedures, the subparadigm of directional equivalence tends to have only two opposed poles for two opposed ways of translating, usually free as opposed to literal. Although there are many versions of these concepts, since translators must decide how they will translate, there is no guarantee that two translations of the exact text will be identical. Now we're going to discuss about the two kinds of similarity. The English theorist Andrew Chesterman argues that the relation between translations and their source texts may be understood in terms of similarity. Points out that there are different kinds of similarity. We might say, for example, that although translations are commonly supposed to be like their source texts, those source texts are not always held to be like their translations. This is strange. The relation to be like may be thought of in two ways. On the one hand, the same quality is considered to be equally present on both sides, so that Friday the 13th in English is like Martes 13 in Spanish, and the same relation may be seen the other way around. On the other hand, we can say that the daughter is like her mother in a sense that she takes after her mother, but we would not usually say that a mother is like her daughter. Chronologically, it isn't likely that she would take after her daughter. In the second case, the relation is asymmetric, with different roles and expectations being placed on the two sides. Chesterman sees these relations as two different kinds of similarity. He represents divergent similarity as what you can see on the slide. Directional equivalence is an asymmetric relation where the creation of an equivalent by translating one way does not imply that the same equivalence will also be created when translating the other way. This may be the way the translator sees the task of translating. A new text is produced which is like its source in some respects, but it does not replace the source. The text continues to exist, and it is only one of many possible representations. Alternative renditions are imaginable, and there may be other translations in the future. What is most apparent here is the directionality that leads from source to target, as from mother to daughter, and does not have the same causal standing the other way around. Chesterman then presents convergent similarity, as what you can see on the slide. And this may be how a translation is seen by its receiver, expecting what they seek in A is also in B. This is the case of Friday the 13th and Martes 13th. Chesterman suggests that these similarity relations may be able to replace theories of equivalence. However, we might also ask if theories of equivalence have long had both relations, albeit without names. The directionality and definitions of relevance. Translating consists in reproducing in the receptor language the closest natural equivalent of the source language message. Consider this definition in terms of directionality. Note that the term equivalent is only of the source language message, so there is no question of that original message being the equivalent of the translation. In that sense, the concept of equivalence would appear to be directional. At the same time, however, the verb reproducing suggests that the natural equivalent exists prior to the act of translation in the makeup of the languages or cultures themselves. To that extent, the definition retains some of the idealism of natural equivalence. In other words, the mode of thought seems to be both natural and directional at the same time. Look closely at the definitions. In each case, the term equivalent describes one side only, the target side. The processes are profoundly directional. Translation goes from one side to the other, but not back again. Many similar definitions may be found in the literature. So it seems that Chesterman's directionality in relations of similarity may also be found in some theories of equivalence. We will use the term directional equivalence to refer to all those cases where an equivalent is located on one side more than the other, at least to the extent that they forget to tell us about movements that could go either way. The term natural equivalence then refers to theories that assume the possibility of an equally balanced two-way movement. Both kinds of equivalence would seem to fall within the one paradigm since they are often blended and we are aware of no major disputes between the two camps. For example, both naturalness and directionality have to be used if we are to cover all the things that happen to the names of game shows, or again, when Vinay and Darbelnet present their list of translation strategies, the mode of thought goes from directional at one end to naturalness at the other. According to the criteria of both directionality and naturalness, you go from one language to the other, and the result is a translation if and when a relationship of equivalence is established on some level. In any theory, look for the definition of translation and try to see what it is assuming, then what it is omitting. What you find usually indicates the strengths and weaknesses of the whole theory. In this case, the strength of the definitions, whether based on naturalness or directionality, is that they have the one term equivalent that distinguishes translation from all the other things that can be done in interlingual communication: rewriting, commentary, summary, parody, and etc. The weakness is that they mostly do not explain why this relation should just be one way in some cases or two way in others. Further, they are often in doubt as to whether the equivalent is equal to a position or value within a language, to a message, to a text with content and style, or to all those things but at different times. So, do relations of equivalence really have to be one way? The question was raised many years ago in an elegant piece of theorizing by Otto Cade, who worked in what was then East Germany. Cade's types of equivalence. Otto Cade proposes 4 types of equivalence. First is a one-to-one. It is a one-source language item corresponds to one target language item. For example, the English word lion corresponds to German Lovey, and this relation may be considered a total equivalence, for as long as neither culture has intimately different relations with lions. The surer examples are technical terms like the names of chemical elements. And the second is the one to several or several to one. An item in one language corresponds to several in the other language. There are 2 ways to understand this. For example, the English word key corresponds to ilave, tecla, and clave in Spanish. And in context, however, the translator will usually know what kind of key is being referred to and will have few real choices to make, which is why this example is from the sub-paradigm of natural equivalence. A different example would be the Spanish term competencia, which could be rendered by responsibility, mandate, domain, competence, and so on. The third is one-to-part. It is only partial equivalents are available, resulting in approximate equivalence. For example, the English term brother has no full equivalent in Chinese or Korean, since the corresponding terms have to specify whether it is an older or younger brother. Whichever choice is made, the equivalence will thus be only approximate. And the last is the one-to-none. No equivalent is available in the target language. For example, most languages did not have a term for a computer a century ago. When that term had to be translated, the translators could use a circumlocution. It is a phrase to describe the object, and they could generate a term from within the target language, or they could borrow the form of the English term. Regarding Cade's categories, the directionality in the above definitions of translation would seem to imply the one-to-several scenario, yet we suspect that Cade's whole theory is ultimate of the directional type since he limits absolute reciprocity to technical terms, probably the least natural pieces of language to be found. In hindsight, Cade's is a remarkable piece of theorizing in that he managed to fit both the natural and directional sub-paradigms into the one frame, and he did so while incorporating some awareness of similarity, which is the approximate equivalence. And now we're going to discuss about the back translation as a test. The simplest test is by translation to see whether an equivalent is natural or directional. This means taking the translation, rendering it back into the source language, and then comparing the two source language versions. When natural equivalence prevails, we can go from Friday to Viernes, then back to Friday, and it makes no difference which term is the source and which the translation. This is because the correspondence existed in some way prior to the act of translation. More to the point, the transfer of the Judeo-Christian 7-day week occurred several millennia before our act of translation, so the original directionality has now come to appear natural. That naturalness is certainly an illusion. In historical terms, all equivalents are probably the result of as much force and authority as is assumed in Cade's one-to-one technical terms. Yet the illusion has had a strong ideological pull on many translation theories. On the level of bad luck, we can indeed go from Friday the 13th to Martes 13 and back again, and we can make people believe that the equivalence is somehow written into the nature of our cultural systems. Lastly, we're going to discuss about the polarities of directional equivalence. Most theories of directional equivalence do not list procedures or linguistic levels, as in theories based on natural equivalence, but instead separate different kinds of equivalence. They also talk about different kinds of translating, which amounts to much the same thing, since you translate quite differently depending on the level at which you want equivalence to work. Dichotomies like Cicero's are found throughout Western translation theory. The early 19th century German preacher and translator Friedrich argued that translations could be either foreignizing or domesticating. He famously described the two possible movements as follows. Either the translator leaves the author in peace as much as possible and moves the reader toward that author, or the translator leaves the reader in peace as much as possible and moves the author toward that reader. Although Frederick's preference was for the foreignizing option, just as Cicero's was for the domesticating method, both approaches ultimately allow the translator to decide. The decision does not particularly depend on the nature of the source text. A similar kind of dichotomy is found in the English translation critic Peter Newmark, 1988, who distinguishes between semantic and communicative translation. The semantic kind of translation would look back to the formal values of the source text and retain them as much as possible. The communicative kind would look forward to the needs of the new addressee, adapting to those needs as much as necessary. Newmark's preferences tend to lie on the semantic side, especially concerning what he terms authoritative text. In theory, translators must choose whether to render one aspect or another of the source text. There is thus no necessary assumption of just one natural equivalent, and the result is a generally directional theory. All these oppositions could be regarded as operating within the equivalence paradigm. In all cases, the two ways to translate can both lay claim to represent some aspect or function of the source. This is the point at which natural equivalence appears to break down. Directionality becomes more critical. We could use it to justify significant textual expansion or reduction. The equivalence paradigm, nevertheless, tends to balk at this frontier. How much explanatory information could we insert and still claim to respect equivalence? There is no explicit agreement. The debate then concerns what is or is not a translation. That is a question that the equivalence paradigm was never designed to address. It merely assumes an answer. To sum it up, directional equivalence is an asymmetric relation where the creation of an equivalent by translating one way does not imply that the exact equivalence will also be created when translating the other way. Theories of directional equivalence allow the translator to choose between several translation strategies, and the source text does not dictate those strategies. And the strategies for directional equivalence tend to be expressed in terms of two opposed poles, where one pole is a strategy that stays close to the source text form, and the other pole is a strategy that departs from that form. For example, formal equivalence is opposed to dynamic equivalence. And finally, we have come to an end of my discussion. However, this is only the part 1 of directional equivalence, and the part 2 which will be discussed by the next reporter.